Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Digby Ricci, and today we continue our exploration of the genius of William Shakespeare in Brushing Up the Bard. This is the first of 3 lectures on Shakespeare's early love tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, the language and imagery of that great text. A rose will bloom, it then will fade, so dies a youth, so dies the fairest maid. Thus warbles the Petrarchan balladeer in Franco Zeffirelli's 1968 film adaptation of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. For many, the universal, timeless appeal of Romeo and Juliet lies in the fact that it is such an agonizing exploration of the destruction of youthful joy and passion. So whether we are looking at the codpieces, the rapiers, the dusty, sun-baked streets of a Tuscan community in Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, or the garish gas stations, whirring police helicopters, mohawks, and revolvers of Baz Luhrmann's Americanized, almost futuristic adaptation, we feel that what makes the tragedy speak to us is the fact that we all sympathize with youthful potential, youthful longing, and we are distressed, greatly distressed, anguished in fact, when youthful potential is destroyed. Now, such a response to the play is by no means inappropriate, but it is, I'm arguing today, somewhat simplistic. There have been so many adaptations of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. In fact, there have been 61 film adaptations, if we include the very first, a very short silent movie dating from about 1901. These adaptations, of course, emphasize the drama of thwarted young love. But Shakespeare, in this much more subtle and complex play, is also very concerned with defining what exactly true love is. And this is what I shall be exploring today, how the language and imagery of the text explores a variety of definitions of love, some of them completely false. So let me begin with what might seem to be a very peculiar springboard for a discussion of a great love tragedy. I want to use a marvelous passage from the great feminist writer Germaine Greer's seminal work, The Female Eunuch. And in this passage, Greer rages against the dishonesty which is cloaked by that comforting catch-all word, love. She writes, "Love, love, love, all the wretched cant of it, masking egotism, lust, masochism, fantasy, under a mythology of sentimental postures." It might seem extreme to say that Shakespeare is very aware of the truth behind Germaine Greer's diatribe. He too examines in this very text the sentimental postures, the lies that often pose as love, while he explores what exactly true love passion is, what a genuine love relationship is. From the outset, love is defined in absentia. We are plunged into a world of brutality and hostility, and the voices that we hear are the voices of the warring servants. We begin with the Capulets, retainers, and Samson and Gregory delight in coarse joking about sexuality. They speak of desire and violence as if they are absolutely identical. They boast about cutting off the heads of the maids, or their maiden heads, take it in what way you wish. Brutality and desire are one. The phallus and the sword are one. And thus the command, draw thy tool, makes that absolutely clear. Now, just in case you think that Shakespeare is being somewhat patronizing to the plebeians and showing that they have a very coarse and brutal attitude towards human desire, consider how Tybalt is presented at the beginning of the play. Tybalt surpasses even his family's retainers in his commitment to sheer aggression. In response to Benvolio's plea to keep the peace, Tybalt replies, "Peace, I hate the word, as I hate hell, all Montagues and thee. Have at thee, coward." And such an attitude is absolutely typical of the single-minded son of pugnacity, as the Shakespearean scholar Harold C. Goddard has called him. When Tybalt spots Romeo, the disguised Romeo, at the Capulets' ball, he insists that to strike him dead, I count it not a sin. Now, it's important to note that from the outset, the Montague-Capulet feud is presented as completely irrational. No cause is given for it. It is simply a traditional, brutal expression of hatred. And it also turns Verona into a nightmarish world in which everything is inverted. Tybalt's language constantly reveals the fact that he regards vices as virtues, and, of course, the opposite. But Prince Aeschylus, in a lengthy denunciation of both the warring families, points out just how unnatural the environment that the feud has created actually is. He speaks of old men taking up weapons, rusted swords clutched in withered hands. He speaks of pernicious rage being quenched only by purple fountains of antagonists' blood. This is a terrifying world that the feud has created, and it is a world which is particularly opposed to the development of love. And this, of course, is the center of the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. In a world of remorseless bloodshed, it is not at all surprising that desire itself is expressed in the most violent terms. The Shakespearean scholar, Professor Molly Mahood, has said that the language of the retainers, particularly the Capulet retainers in this early stage of the play, is a debased, brutal language expressed largely in what she calls sadistic quibbles, vicious, baldy punning. Now, the language of the retainers, the servants, is often contrasted by scholars with the language of Romeo when he is infatuated with the distant, indeed unattainable Rosaline. Commentators point out that whereas the servants are committed to a brutal, male-dominated definition of love, Romeo's Petrarchan love for Rosaline rather emphasizes the power of the icily distant female figure. This is the subjection of the adoring male to the powerful woman. However, if we look more closely at the language which Romeo uses, we see that his language is actually a mass of contradictions. He is undoubtedly suffering. Romeo's father, in fact, points out that Romeo is afflicted by what the Elizabethans would have called love melancholy. In fact, old Montague describes his son as being like a bud bitten by an envious worm. And the image, of course, stresses Romeo's youth, his beauty, and his fragility, as well as the voracious, self-destructive aspect of unrequited love. However, Romeo does not only wallow in self-pity. He is quite determined to conquer Rosaline if he can, and he uses the resources of the lover, or he has rather attempted to use the resources of the lover. Sighs, pleas, assailing eyes, and he even mentions in a rather disturbing and somewhat distasteful phrase, saint seducing gold. This subtle mythological allusion to Zeus's rape of Danae, he appeared to her in the form of a shower of gold, is somewhat distasteful, for it suggests that Romeo is quite prepared to use rich gifts to win the affections of his unattainable mistress. So there is an element of posturing, a certain degree of wallowing in misery about Romeo's so-called love for Rosaline, no matter how much pain it is actually causing him. And the most appropriate device to express the contradictions of this infatuation is, of course, the oxymoron, the juxtaposition of compressed opposites. And so Romeo speaks with exaggerated grief of brawling love, of loving hate, of anything from nothing first create, still waking, still their meaning always sleep, etc., etc. Now this cluster of oxymorons reveals the fact that Romeo is really in love with the idea of being agonizingly in love. He is delighting in generalized statements, the oxymorons that do not seem to relate very specifically to his own plight. I'm not suggesting, as some critics seem to do, that the oxymoron is by definition an expression of generalized insincerity. Not at all. One should contrast the generalized platitudes that Romeo uses about the delights and pangs of being in love with a torrent of oxymorons that Juliet uses in Act 3, when she is struggling to come to terms with the horror of the fact that Romeo has been responsible for the death of her cousin. Romeo, her beloved husband as he is, has been responsible for this death. And Juliet uses oxymorons here, but they relate very specifically to her situation. They assist her to come to terms with the conflict within her nature at this stage. She sees Romeo as possessing a serpent heart hid with a flowering face, and she laments the fact that evil can exist in such a gorgeous palace. She is not being melodramatic here, for she really does feel an appalling conflict. This is the man she loves, and he has been responsible for the death of a beloved relative. So Juliet's emotions, heightened and agonized at this point, are best expressed in the oxymoron, which encapsulates so precisely the grief-stricken ambivalence of her feelings. On the other hand, Romeo's oxymorons about his infatuation with Rosaline are essentially literary cliches. He is delighting in his pain, even though the pain may be real, because it keeps the spotlight upon him. He is the supreme suffering lover, and that is a very important pose he feels to adopt at this stage. In a legendary 1935 production of Romeo and Juliet, directed by Sir John Gielgud, a wonderful costume was used for Romeo in what could be called his Rosaline phase. Gielgud chose a costume which united sombre dove grey and cold blue with a jarringly lurid yellow hat, because yellow, of course, is the colour of narcissism. And this, of course, sums up brilliantly this choice of costume. It sums up brilliantly Romeo's posturing. There is an element of performance in his supposed love agony about Rosaline. Now we must move on to another definition of love, which is explored in the text. So far, we've looked at the debased, brutalized view of desire of the retainers, the servants of the Montagues and the Capulets, and we've examined too Romeo's definition of love when he dotes on Rosaline. The emphasis is placed on his feelings rather than on the feelings of the supposed object of his affections. What about the character of Mercutio, one of the most beloved characters in Romeo and Juliet, and understandably because of the extraordinary ingenuity of his wit? Mercutio is a master of humour, often dark humour, and verbal skill. But his definition of love is a denigratory one. He makes mocking allusions to Cupid as a lawless beggar, to Venus as a gossip, and he defines Rosaline as simply a catalogue of alluring body parts, inevitably ending with her thighs and the areas that adjacent lie. In fact, Mercutio cannot even tell the time without making a brilliant bawdy joke. When the startled nurse expresses amazement that it is already noon, Mercutio confirms in one of the most brilliant, if obscene, metaphors in literature that the bawdy hand of dial is upon the very prick of noon. Now, we might delight in the undoubted wit of Mercutio and his extraordinary use of bawdy humour, but it is important to note that Shakespeare does criticise him as well for his constant denigration of human emotions and desires. Romeo's condemnation of Mercutio, which is expressed in a very brilliant epigram, should be taken more seriously. Romeo says of his friend, "He jests at scars that never felt a wound." He jests at scars that never felt a wound. Mercutio's wit is considerable, even enviable, but there does not seem to be considerable depth of feeling within him. Even the extraordinary and fascinating Queen Mab speech, if one looks at it closely, reveals a very denigratory attitude towards humanity. Queen Mab is the fairy's midwife, the creator of fantasies and imaginings, but she exposes the hidden desires and appetites of human beings at their most avaricious, their most trivial, their most lustful. And she punishes them for these concealed and often not so well concealed desires. So she blisters the sweetened lips of flirtatious women. She further tangles the already snarled hair of slatterns. She makes soldiers dream of improbable victories. She makes parsons dream greedily of increased tithes, and so on. She is associated with the tiniest of creatures and with fragments of the tiniest of creatures. And when Mercutio enlarges her in his description, she becomes a demonic incubus who presses upon sleeping virgins and teaches them how to bear. It is in many ways a beautiful and extraordinary piece of imagination. But when one analyzes it in more detail, there is something somewhat unpleasant about it as well, in its darkly imagined vision of humanity in all its pettiness and desire. Harold C. Goddard, the great Shakespearean critic, is quite right, I think, when he speaks of the prankish ingenuity of Mercutio's Queen Mab speech, but ultimately sees it as a limited vision, a vision which in no way accommodates the potential of humanity. Mercutio is a man of flamboyant imagination and extraordinary verbal skill, and yet his vision of humanity is a restricted one. He is incapable of understanding love in any full sense of that word. He understands lust alone And although we find enjoyable, entertaining, even very amusing his constant bawdy wit, we must be aware of his limitations. It's a great loss when Mercutio leaves the play, but it is important to remember that he is associated very strongly with the feud rather than with the love relationship of Romeo and Juliet. It is absolutely apt that Mercutio is killed by the fiery Tybalt. He belongs in the same environment as the fiery Tybalt. He is immensely aggressive, both verbally and physically. And there is also no indication in Shakespeare's text that Mercutio has any idea of the transformation that Romeo has undergone when Romeo moves from the muddled doting, the self-centered infatuation that is Romeo in his Rosaline phase, to the genuine and complex love that he feels for Juliet. For the language of real love is, of course, the language of Romeo and Juliet themselves. And it is important that one looks in great detail at just how beautiful and multifaceted their exchanges are. When Romeo first sees Juliet at the Capulets' ball, he exclaims, "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright," and says that she hangs upon the cheek of night as a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear, and that her beauty is too rich for use, for earth too dear. Now, this language, of course, is beautiful because it is so specific and so deeply felt, so very different from the generalizing oxymorons of Romeo's response to Rosaline. He emphasizes Juliet's passion and energy. He also refers to her radiant beauty and her purity. Her vitality surpasses the blaze of torchlight. She is as beautiful and precious as the most priceless of gems. The surroundings seem no more than a setting for her. The darkness is the darkness of the skin that sets off the magnificent jewel in the Ethiop's ear. And she is like a dove trooping among crows. Her purity is emphasized too. As I'm sure you can pick up from the passages that I've quoted, this language is imbued with an extraordinary quality. It unites spirituality and desire, and it is very specific as well. Romeo is looking at the woman he loves and describing her beauty and how he responds to it. There is a passionate sincerity in this language, and there is a union of the earthly and the heavenly. And I think this is an appropriate point at which to end this first lecture, because I shall have a lot more to say about the language of Romeo and Juliet's love, genuine love, the real thing, particularly in their first love sonnet and the extraordinary balcony scene, which I shall reserve for the second lecture. Thank you very much.